The game of basketball has been around for over 100 years, and during that passage of time, many developments have happened that have softened up the sport and the competitors involved. In this video, we're traveling back in time, further and further into the past, as the league simultaneously becomes more and more barbaric, to the extent that some of you may find hard to believe. Let's start in somewhat recent history, which is the early 2000s. For most of NBA history, the offensive 3-second violation rule has been in place, but the defensive 3-second violation did not exist until the 2001 to 2002 season. As most of you know, the defensive 3-second violation is when the defender is in the painted area for at least 3 seconds, while not actively guarding an opponent, which will result in a technical free throw for the opposing team. Before the year 2001, NBA centers could simply camp under the basket, providing constant rim protection for their team. But with the new 3-second rule, centers had to be constantly moving in and out of the paint to avoid a violation. Less time being spent in the paint meant that less dunks and layups were being contested at the rim. Pre-2001, there was almost always a big simply waiting in the painted area where he could make it difficult for penetrating players to score. Because of this, players in the 90s were frequently receiving contact when getting close to the basket. But with that being said, even that era could be considered soft when compared to the more barbaric decades before it. So let's go a little further back in time. The year is 1990, and the NBA is coming off of a decade of the bad boy Detroit Pistons mauling opposing teams on a nightly basis. For example, the Pistons famously had the quote Jordan rules, which were essentially specific tactics about how they would defend Michael Jordan. One of those tactics was that whenever he got in the air, they would put him on his butt. These methods were extremely dangerous and could certainly result in injuries for some of the premier players in the league. Strategically, from a defensive standpoint, it made sense why there were so many hard fouls in the 1980s. Because if a hard foul is the same penalty as a soft foul, then you might as well make the most of it as the defender and make them think twice about attacking the basket next time. That's when the league decided to change things in 1990 and made a flagrant foul a 2-shot penalty and possession of the basketball and a potential disqualification. This drastic change to the league's officiating made the game significantly less punishing basically overnight. But even the bad boy Pistons look soft when they're compared to the more grueling eras before them. Let's go further back in time. The year is 1980, and the NBA is coming off of a decade where fights and substance abuse were rampant throughout the league. The physicality was also quite intense throughout the 1970s, which caused the league office to evaluate their product and adjust the rules in an attempt to clean up their image. So in the year 1980, they decided to create the original flagrant foul rule. This was not the same as the stricter rule in 1990, but this rule simply defined it as a move that, quote, puts the safety or health of the opposing player at risk. When this flagrant foul was first introduced, it was not 2 free throws and possession of the basketball, but instead it was basically treated as a common foul, with the only additional penalty being that the opposing coach got to choose who shot the 2 free throws. Prior to this rule being established, there was basically no additional penalties for unnecessary roughness while fouling a player, which obviously meant much of the 70s and 60s were like the Wild West, as there wasn't much that you were not allowed to do. But even with this being said, this era would still be considered soft compared to the more savage eras that came before it. So let's go even further back in time. The year is 1936, which was more than a decade before the NBA was created. But with that being said, developing basketball leagues were still very prominent in the United States. One of the major developments was the offensive 3-second rule in 1936, which stated that a player couldn't be standing in the offensive key for at least 3 seconds. Without a flagrant foul rule of any sort, and without a penalty for camping under either basket, battling for rebounds was like a chaotic frenzy. Under the rim was basically a crowded war zone on any given night, as players battled for extra opportunities with few interruptions from the referees. Believe it or not, even this wasn't the most brutal era of basketball. To see that, we have to go even further back in time, towards the earliest days of the sport. The year is 1891, and Dr. James Naismith, a 31-year-old Canadian man, had just recently invented the game of basketball in Springfield, Massachusetts. When Naismith introduced the game to the world, some of the most popular sports in the area were rugby and American football. So obviously, operating from their familiar experience, people played the game of basketball as if it was rugby and American football. If you consider yourself a lover of tough physical defense to the point that it makes games extremely low scoring, well then this was the era for you. The very first basketball game ever held was in a YMCA training center between 18 male students, most of whom were in their early 20s. The hoop was made out of a peach basket that was nailed to some railing around 10 feet high into the air. Naismith was officiating the game, and he divided the teams into 9 players each. The game lasted for a total of 30 minutes, and it had an epic final score of 1-0. Months passed, but the early days of the game continued to have a raucous atmosphere, as players were grappling, pulling, pushing, tackling, and slamming into one another. This brutal and chaotic style created an exciting atmosphere for new basketball fans, and those fans began feeding off of that energy and became extremely rowdy as a result. In those early days of organized basketball, spectators and fans would often storm the courts and interfere with play due to the sheer excitement. So as a way to keep the fans from interfering with the leagues, they constructed steel wire cages to go around the basketball courts. That's right, basketball games used to be played in cages as if they were witnessing a UFC fight. With that being said, players did not tone down the physicality once the cages were installed. Players would often slam and throw each other into the steel cage, and as a result, they would be finishing games with cuts and bruises all over their bodies. One of those early players said that the courts were often covered in blood, and would even have stains all over from previous games. By far, this was the most barbaric and brutal era of basketball history, to the point that even the bad boy Pistons looked like soft pansies by comparison. Players in those days were often referred to as cagers because of their punishing style of play in those cages. It stayed that way for several years, but in the early 1900s, basically everyone was tremendously relieved when they replaced the steel cages with rope mesh nets, which significantly reduced the amount of injuries during the action. So what do you guys think? Which era had the perfect amount of physicality for the game of basketball? Are you a psychopath who would like to see the cages return? Or are you someone who prefers a league with free reign to the rim? Whatever your perspective may be, I look forward to hearing it in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.